on the first warm Saturday of spring, the kind that turns dry soil into a forgiving canvas. I finished pressing the last flagstone into a bed of crushed granite and leaned back to study the curve of the path. Bees stitched lazy arcs between lavender mounds. A monarch tested the milkweed like a critic tasting soup. The cedar trellis, still raw and pale, framed the view of the raised beds I had built from reclaimed redwood. It all felt like a small breathing engine designed to turn sun and water into calm. That's when the paper showed up, bright and smug on my front door, flapping in the same breeze that carried rosemary. The notice was measured in threats per paragraph. The Homeowners Association recorded that my unauthorized landscaping elements violated bylaws about sightlines. Uniformity, decorative rock color, edging height, and the audacity required to install a trellis without a permission slip. It promised daily fines, escalating penalties, and the eventual correction of the violation by removal. The word sat there with the subtlety of a bulldozer. The thing about rules is that they feel tidy until you remember why people start gardens in the first place. I had built mine after a winter that chewed on every nerve like rats in the walls. Grief is a slow, stubborn thing, and clearing the strip of thirsty lawn in my front yard was the first time I felt like I could make anything beautiful that stayed beautiful. I replaced monotony with intention, perennials for pollinators, herbs for meals, native grasses to feed birds. A compost bay that ticked softly like a patient clock. The HOA saw rocks and wood and a color not approved on a chart. I saw evidence that I could carry water in both hands without spilling, that mornings had weight again. The first violation came with instructions to apply for retroactive approval. I did, and sent photos, plant lists, and a sketch where I had even labeled setbacks from the sidewalk. Weeks passed. Another notice arrived as if the first had never met sunlight. Then another, with fines that would make a credit card tremble. The board set a compliance hearing. That phrase made me want to add barbed wire and call it decor. I attended anyway, sat in a folding chair in a room that smelled like lemon cleaner and recycled fear, and described percolation rates in native habitat. Heads nodded in slow motion, not with understanding, but in rhythm with a script they had already memorized. There is an art to saying no without moving your mouth. The board had it. They cited rules about uniform front landscapes, a concern about property values, and a clause about structures that had to be 5 feet back from the sidewalk, unless decorative and temporary. The trellis, stained by the sun but apparently permanent, scared them, maybe because it suggested a future richer than a hedge. The final letter came in a manila envelope, heavy with performance. It explained that if I did not remove the trellis, the raised beds, and the path within 10 days, the HOA would hire a contractor to restore the lawn and bill me for the privilege. A line about equipment access gave the game away. They were threatening to bulldoze my garden. Not theoretically, logistically. Fear is mean when it first arrives. It wants to pace and shake the windows and run worst-case scenarios like an entertainment channel. I let it burn itself out while I weeded the thyme. Then I made tea and moved the letter under a magnet next to grocery coupons so it wouldn't feel special. Rules exist. Communities need order. But order with no imagination is a factory, not a neighborhood. I'd given the association every chance to be curious. What I hadn't done yet was be loud. The moment I decided to fight back was not cinematic. It happened as I watched a hummingbird land on the very trellis the board wanted gone, holding still like a jewel pinned by light. The bird didn't belong to me, and that felt important. I had built an invitation, and something wild had RSVP'd. If the board wanted to call it a violation, I would call it a venue. Turning a front yard into a garden had been an act of healing. Turning a garden into a statement would be an act of survival. I started a list, not of plants, but of possibilities. The city had rules. Yes. But it also had programs for public benefit spaces, event permits, small nonprofits, and educational designations. There were insurance policies for community gardens. There were accessibility checklists for public pathways. There were design standards that favored native habitat. A lawn was easy. Public garden required a binder. While the sun went down and the sprinkler heads across the street hissed to life, the bones of a new plan took root. If they tried to bulldoze my garden as a private nuisance, they would have to bulldoze a public asset. The The same bylaws that choked one person's creativity were not designed to throttle a registered, insured, city-recognized educational garden. The HOA wanted uniformity. I could give them paperwork. I slept with open windows, the better to hear the night insects making their small music. In the morning, I measured slopes and gaps in the distance from the sidewalk to each border. I took photos and sketched a diagram clean enough to quiet the fussiest clerk. I read bylaws until they blurred, and then I read city code until it sharpened again. The board had a directory of fines, had a path to legitimacy. On the 10th day, when the clock on the threat ran out, I was ready to be something they hadn't planned for. The garden looked the same from the street. Underneath it had changed categories in my mind. I didn't know if the city would say yes quickly, or if the board would send trucks before anyone stamped anything official. I only knew that momentum was a kind of light, and I had turned it toward the front yard. The letter on the fridge was still there. It glared. I composted my fear and fed my resolve. The next step would not be private, and that is how the garden, once a quiet project with roots in grief, became a strategy. The notice wasn't about plants anymore. It was about who got to decide what beauty looked like on a block of matching roofs. If they wanted to fight, I would give them a festival. The next chapter of this story would begin at City Hall, the stack of forms and a garden that had decided it was too big to stay behind a property line. City Hall smelled like dust and old coffee, which comforted me. Because both of those things meant people worked there long enough to get bored and make exceptions. I arrived with diagrams, plant lists, a maintenance plan, a calendar of proposed open hours, a liability waiver template, and a portable measuring wheel that made me feel like a tiny road crew. The receptionist pointed me to planning, then to parks, then to a window where a clerk read my forms and adjusted their posture, not toward dismissal, but toward curiosity. The word public pulls a magnet through bureaucracy. I had written it everywhere. The city had a mechanism for community gardens and a separate one for educational demonstration sites. Neither was built with homeowners associations in mind, but neither prohibited them. The rules required accessible paths with a certain width and slope, a posted sign with contact information, clearly marked hours, proof of insurance, and a plan for restroom access during events. There were noise thresholds and traffic considerations. None of it was mystical. All of it was possible. The clerk slid me a checklist with the softness a person reserves for someone who has done their homework. I had a carpenter square in my trunk, had a friend who could pour a short run of permeable pavers for an accessible path if I bartered with sourdough loaves. I had a neighbor with a detached studio that could host a tiny restroom during public hours for a % of donations. I had a printer. I had a garden that already did the only thing the city truly prized. It made people feel like the place they lived was better than it had to be. The HOA continued like a metronome in the background. Another letter arrived. The fines climbed a staircase in precise increments. A compliance officer snapped photos from the sidewalk with the cheerless focus of a person keeping a tally on someone else's life. On trash day, the board sent a mass email about increased enforcement and visual cohesion. My garden was now a line item next to recycling bins set out too early. It would have been funny if it hadn't been expensive. The first inspection from the city was gentle and stern. The planner walked the path, noted the spot where the slope exceeded the standard, and asked for an alternate route around a raised bed. They measured the height of the trellis and suggested anchoring hardware to satisfy wind load language. They suggested a sign with ours that made sense. They asked about parking on event days and how I would keep visitors from tromping across neighboring lawns. They mentioned the need for an umbrella liability policy. It all went into a list with checkboxes I could feed on like candy. While I coordinated those fixes, the HOA set a date for remediation. The phrase was cold. It meant demolition dressed up in a lab coat. The letter included a date and time and the name of a contractor that specialized in landscape reset. I read it on a Wednesday morning while the dew was still thinking about evaporating. The contractor would arrive with equipment access through the side gate. They were prepared to remove unauthorized structures and restore front yard to original builder-approved condition. If I blocked them, the letter claimed, I would be considered non-compliant and subject to legal action. The ground shifted. Not under my garden, but under the narrative. The board had stopped pretending this was about rules and started behaving like a demolition crew with a spreadsheet. The contractor's name gave me leverage, I called the city planner not for sympathy but for clarity. The application for community garden status was in progress. Did that status, once confirmed, protect the garden from private enforcement? The planner reminded me that while the city and the HOA lived in overlapping maps, they did not share a chain of command. However, if the site had an active permit application and the work in question overlapped with public safety elements under review, the city could issue a stop work advisory. It wouldn't be a shield against everything, but it would be a pause button powerful enough to turn a bulldozer into a parked vehicle. I requested it, and the city agreed, attaching the advisory to my parcel number and emailing the contractor directly. The letter informed them that elements of the site were under active permit review, and that removal of those elements could interfere with compliance being sought in good faith. The advisory didn't scold. It chilled. Contractors live on paper as much as on diesel. I printed the letter in duplicate and taped one copy to the trellis. Inside a sheet protector, because I'm the kind of person who carries those. Meanwhile, I paid for the liability policy, installed the paver loop with a weekend of careful shovel work, mounted the sign with ours and a QR code to a web page I built in a delirious night, and set up an email list. I named the site for the creek that ran underground beneath our neighborhood, buried in pipes decades ago. The signage turned the lawn's former anonymity into a place with a name. Places with names can call for help. The contractor emailed me directly, a tidy note acknowledging the city's advisory. They would inform the HOA that until the review concluded, work would be postponed. The board blasted another message about rogue actions and circumvention of governance, but even their bravado sounded dented. A delay was not a victory, but it was oxygen. I used it. I scheduled a soft opening. Not a festival. Not a street-clogging bacchanal that would hand the board a complaint on a platter. I planned a Saturday morning with posted hours, a box for donations, a loop of signs with plant names and blurbs about pollinators, and a subtle program of guided strolls, where I could narrate what the space did besides annoy people who valued beige. I emailed the city, invited the planner to witness that this was a public benefit in spirit and not just on paper, and I invited neighbors, even the ones who glared. I printed a handful of Junior Pollinator Ranger stickers that I designed in an hour with clip art and unnecessary enthusiasm. The morning of the opening, I woke before the light and listened to the pre-dawn quiet that feels like a held breath. The path looked expectant. The trellis cast a shadow like a sundial. The box of stickers sat next to a jar of wildflower seeds tied in little envelopes with twine. My attempt at bribery disguised as outreach. I expected 5 people. I feared a letter. I got something else entirely. A local blogger included the event in a weekend roundup. A photographer who documents small wonders showed up with a camera and the soft patience of someone who knows how to wait for bees. A preschool teacher brought 12 small people who pointed at everything as if personally surprised by flowers. A city council aide texted the planner and then stopped by, hands in pockets, non-committal and watchful. Exactly the right posture for someone who might later be asked to remember what happened. Donations clinked. Laughter moved like wind. The garden became a stage, and I reluctantly became a narrator. When closing time came, I posted a recap, not bragging, but grateful. The QR code linked to photos and an explanation of what the HOA wanted to do versus what the garden had already done. Watching the clicks tick up felt like seeing a tide come in. I could tell the story now without raising my voice. The place did it for me. The board had scheduled demolition. I had scheduled an audience. The next step would be inevitable. The HOA would escalate. So would I. The escalation did not arrive with subtlety. The board locked into a schedule it had created for itself. Insisted that remediation would proceed on the new date they announced. City advisory be damned. They framed it as assertiveness. It read as tantrum. They sent a message to the community claiming that the garden posed unquantified risks, that the trellis obstructed lines of sight, and that unapproved gatherings threatened to depress values. The words had worn a groove. They slid easy. The difference now was that my garden had a mailing list and a permit number in processing, and perhaps more importantly, a public that had grown curious. The morning the contractor was supposed to arrive, I rolled the trash bins away from the curb and placed a folding table near the sidewalk with laminated copies of the city's advisory, the pending permit application, the insurance certificate, and a stack of one-page explanations of the garden's purpose. The table was not a barricade. It was a syllabus. Volunteers drifted in with travel mugs and quiet resolve. I hadn't asked anyone to come. But people show up for things that make them feel like the place they live is worth defending. At 8 a.m., a pickup truck with amber strobes idled at the end of the block, followed by a flatbed carrying a compact loader. The contractor stepped out, a person built for mornings, the brim of their cap shading a face that read maps and risk. They walked to the table, read the advisory, and nodded once at the sentence about interference with an active review. They placed a phone call that involved no emotion I could read. Then they studied the trellis like a doctor evaluating a patient who had a stubborn opinion. Finally, they told their crew to kill the engine. Work for the moment would not begin. The HOA president arrived like weather, wore an expression that insisted on control, the kind of look that has never met a camera without asking for its good side. They approached the contractor and gestured in the direction of the trellis, as if pointing at the root of all disorder. The contractor listened, then handed over the printed advisory and pointed at a number labeled Permit Specialist. The exchange was low to the ground, not dramatic, but it shifted something enormous. If the enforcement mechanism depends on contractors willing to act, then paper can be a gate. The contractor declined to pass through. The neighborhood was awake. People with dogs slowed their walks, windows tilted open. A kid on a scooter orbited. The scene was not a protest, but it had the posture of a community choosing an outcome. I stood next to the table and explained one person at a time what the city was reviewing, what the garden did, and why the board's insistence on lawn uniformity was less about aesthetics and more about power. I used words like habitat and drainage and public benefit. The phrases were the same ones the board used, just with a different ambition. The HOA wanted control. I wanted a place capable of generosity. By mid-morning, a local journalist had arrived. Tipped off by the same blogger who had covered the opening, they took photos that made the loader look like a stranger at a birthday party. The story they filed later would be measured in clicks, but that day it was measured in raised eyebrows. Paper and presence outmaneuvered stubbornness. The HOA president, after a call in the shade that ended in a posture of disappointment practiced in mirrors, announced that out of an abundance of caution, the remediation would be postponed pending clarification. They used words like someone borrowing a language they disliked. Postponement is the child of momentum. I knew better than to gloat. I used the reprieve to finish the accessibility loop with a second layer of screenings, and invited a local master gardener to walk the site and suggest improvements that would outlast any argument. I added bird baths at heights accessible to little eyes. I installed a small bulletin board with handouts about drought-tolerant planting and a weekly calendar. I published quiet guidelines for visitors about hours and parking and respect. The garden matured in tiny gestures while the board drafted a new campaign. The new campaign arrived as policy proposals: stricter limits on front yard plantings, prohibitions on structures with definitions broad enough to include kindness, and a registration requirement for any public-facing activity. They listed fines that could buy a used car. They scheduled a vote. The email announcing it deployed phrases about protecting community standards and ensuring cohesion. Words built fences as effectively as lumber. The difference now was that the garden had fans, some of whom did not live one cul-de-sac away but a city over. Families who had visited on Saturday wrote notes about milkweed and bees. A teacher sent a photo of students drawing lupins like they meant it. Someone posted a time-lapse of butterflies wrestling in slow ecstasy. The story had stopped being mine. The board could enforce rules on owners, could not fine the city for approving a public demonstration garden. It certainly couldn't invoice parents for the moment their kid realized a bee had knees. The permit moved forward. An inspector measured the revised slope and nodded. The planner ticked boxes without ceremony. The parks liaison suggested adding an educational placard about the buried creek whose name I'd borrowed, which made me feel like I had reached back in time and apologized to water. The city issued a permit number, and with it, a thin but real shield. The garden was now a registered insured. City-recognized public demonstration garden operating on posted hours and subject to municipal oversight. It was not a business, it was a place. It had paperwork that said so. The HOA's vote went forward anyway. Rules, regardless of how the world changes around them, like to act as if they are static. The meeting was crowded and uneasy. Neighbors who once forgot my name now remembered the flowers. People who love rules sat next to people who love routines, two different species, often mistaken for one another. When the board presented the amendments, they met a murmur that moved through the room like wind before weather. The motion to adopt stricter bans on front yard structures failed by a margin bigger than anyone had expected. The board looked surprised, as if order had betrayed them. The garden had not voted. It had merely changed minds that did. That evening, as the garden exhaled the earthy breath that comes with dusk, I updated the website with the permit number and a section titled, "Plan Your Visit." It felt absurd and exactly right. I added a link to a volunteer form and a note about upcoming workshops on composting, native planting, and irrigation. I reached out to a local nursery about a modest sponsorship, not for cash, but for a monthly tray of seedlings to give away. I floated the idea of a tiny seasonal market with 2 tables of honey, soap, seeds, and herbs, under the safe umbrella of educational demonstration. The garden's roots reached past my lot line. The bulldozer had blinked. The board was regrouping. City had spoken softly but materially. The story had clicked into a new mode, where the best defense was not anger, but usefulness. The next chapter would require scaling usefulness until even the board, as most dedicated catastrophizers, would have to admit that the place they kept calling a violation was the only thing lately making the neighborhood famous for something other than driveway conformity. It takes only a few weekends for a routine to become an institution. By the end of summer, the garden hosted morning hours on Saturdays, and one late afternoon a week, when the light made the lavender glow like it had its own weather. The signboard listed upcoming topics: building habitat with messy edges, pruning roses without fear, saving seeds like secrets, and coaxing edible abundance out of 6 inches of soil. I spoke less than I expected to, because other voices arrived: horticulturists, a water district educator, a beekeeper who knits calm like a spell, and stands at the edge of their boxes with a stillness that bees respect. The neighborhood shifted from wary to proud in increments measured by stroller density. Photos proliferated. A local cafe offered a pollinator latte. In a moment of ridiculous solidarity that tasted like 10% syrup and 90% marketing, and I loved them for it, because they donated 10% of sales to the Garden-S liability insurance. The City's Parks Department added the garden to a list of self-guided microparks on its website, a category someone invented after a meeting because bureaucracy is a living thing and good ideas force policy out of its pajamas. The HOA, unsettled by losing a battle on their home turf, retreated to strategy. They pushed parking restrictions on weekends that would have stranded visitors 2 blocks away. They proposed a temporary moratorium on new front yard plantings, pending a comprehensive review, which sounded like a government trying to remember how to be gentle while picking up a hammer. They wrote stern reminders about trash bins and porch furniture. That last detail told me they were losing altitude. When you can't control the garden, you tighten the hinge on the mailbox. We countered not with war, but with logistics. I met a shuttle company that runs electric golf carts on downtown nights and booked them for Saturdays, framing it as an accessibility service with a humor that softened inconvenience. Volunteers wore lanyards that looked official enough to calm a worrier. A neighbor with a wide driveway 2 streets over offered it for overflow bike parking, and I designed a sign for it that made it feel like an amenity rather than a favor. The garden became good at solving the problems it created. The board grew less good at inventing problems people believed in. Tour buses did not arrive. This was not that story. But school buses did. Short ones with a handful of kids who needed the world to be smaller and predictable, before it could be big and astonishing. Homeschool groups came with clipboards and pencils and a level of concentration that made adults step back and breathe more carefully. We set up a simple scavenger hunt. Find something fuzzy. Find something that smells like a memory. Find a plant that wants to be left alone. Find a plant that makes friends. The garden taught without trying, because everything alive is an exhibit if you hold your questions the right way. Donations paid for mulch and insurance, and eventually, a small fund that covered seedlings for neighbors who wanted to convert a strip of lawn into habitat. Those conversions, landscaped with a restrained hand and a bias for natives, did more to restore calm than any email I could write. Beauty that repeats itself can either feel like a dictatorship or a choir. The block transformed into the latter, one small patch at a time. The HOA stopped calling it an eyesore, because that word started to bounce off reality without leaving a mark. The board still had its faithful. There are always people who choose rules because rules promise a world that doesn't surprise them. They filed noise complaints when the wind chimes sang a little too eagerly. They measured shadows at noon and dutifully reported their findings as if sunlight worked for them. But the municipal permit and the garden's popularity blunted their spears. The police sent once on a call about unauthorized commercial activity, smiled at a jar of herbs and a laminated sign that said, "Donations help cover insurance," and drove away in a posture that read a little like gratitude. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was a spreadsheet. Someone leaked the HOA's budget at the annual meeting level of detail, and it revealed a line item labeled Enforcement Council that had doubled in a year.
Ow.
Lawyers are what you buy when you have lost imagination. The special assessment that would follow to cover that line item did not go down like lemonade. Neighbors who had enjoyed the soothing fiction that the board existed to keep the fence painters consistent realized it had drifted into a hobby of expensive scolding. A whisper campaign turned audible. Recall petitions sprouted like mushrooms after rain. I did not lead the recall. I tended a garden. But I offered the garden as neutral ground for conversations about what the association should be for. People met under the trellis and talked about stewardship instead of surveillance. Right next to a sign that explained how milkweed helps monarchs, which felt like not an accident. The board scheduled a special meeting to scold the neighborhood about decorum. The neighborhood scheduled a recall vote to scold the board about spending. The walls of the clubhouse began to listen. In the weeks before the vote, the garden drew its largest crowd yet at a workshop on rain capture that promised a simple truth. You can store water invisibly and bring it back when you need kindness in July. A city engineer with a voice, like a metronome, explained dry wells and roof lines and infiltration rates. The HOA president's car idled at the curb for a while and then left. That was the day I understood that the board feared two things: precedent and joy. We had produced both with receipts. When the recall ballots were counted, the result was not close. New board members took seats with expressions that mixed relief and panic, the way people look when they win a prize that turns out to be a job. They campaigned on sanity and transparency. The first thing they did was halt all action on front yard enforcement unrelated to actual hazards. The second thing they did was schedule a listening session at the garden, which quietly announced that they understood where power had moved, away from a dais and toward a path that curved between time and sage. By fall, the city added a blurb about the garden to a regional tourism page that highlights pocket attractions. It was one paragraph between a mural and a bakery. It did what paragraphs do when attached to maps. It sent people with cameras and comfortable shoes to my street. The HOA, new board and all, could have fought the word tourist. They chose instead to own it carefully, adding a note to the neighborhood newsletter about our local public garden's visiting hours, along with a reminder about crosswalks. That sentence felt like an apology written by a place to itself. We had traveled from violation to venue. Kea the bulldozer had become folklore. The board had discovered that governing is cheaper when you help, rather than hinder. The chapter that followed would not be about winning, but about making the win stick. A garden is not permanent just because it is popular. It is permanent because it roots into policy as deeply as it roots into soil. The next step was to write those roots down. Rules are often written after the fact to explain why something we already decided to love is allowed to stay. The new board, with the resignation of a jury foreman, announced a review of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Those foundational pages that once scolded trellises for daring to exist, they formed a committee with a composition that made me want to applaud quietly. To landscape professionals, a disability access advocate, a former code officer from another city, and 3 neighbors whose front yards were textbook versions of lawn and hedge. Because representation matters, even when your aesthetic has the charisma of cardboard. The committee walked the block with clipboards, not to tally violations, but to count possibilities. They noted where sightlines at corners needed practical respect, not weaponized pretext. They measured setbacks that had been applied as if they were holy writ, and discovered they were flexible when safety was at stake. They surveyed the neighborhood and found that what people valued most was not uniformity, but effort yards tended with care, whether in drought-tolerant gravel patterns or lush borders. The report they produced landed like an overdue laugh. The amendments proposed were symphonic in their reasonableness. They introduced a category called public benefit landscape, defined as any front or side yard that, by design and operation, provided ecological, educational, or community value beyond a private lawn. Eligible properties had to meet accessibility standards for any space open to visitors, post hours, maintain insurance if inviting the public, and adhere to common sense rules about noise and traffic. They allowed structures of modest scale such as trellises, benches, and interpretive signs. They created a streamlined review process with a checklist instead of a capricious tribunal. They included a pilot program for microgrants to encourage native plant conversions, and they codified that HOA enforcement would pause when a city permit process was actively underway. The bulldozer clause, the one that had haunted my mornings, was replaced by a pathway to compliance. There was dissent, of course. A small but spirited group insisted that any deviation from the original builder brochure would ruin resale values. The committee met that fear with comps and appraisals from similar neighborhoods where thoughtful landscapes had increased desirability. Data is a blunt instrument against nostalgia. It still worked. The amendments passed with a majority that made the word mandate feel almost appropriate in a room decorated with watercolor paintings of mallards. Simultaneously, the city extended its embrace. Parks official proposed a network of pollinator corridors, linking small spaces like mine with school gardens and median strips planted with natives. The HOA, now in the mood to be liked, offered to facilitate conversions in common areas in exchange for a modest credit on water bills negotiated by the water district. The result was not immediate. It was a calendar dotted with small decisions that, taken together, bent the landscape toward hospitality. The old board did not vanish into the air. There were murmurs of a legal challenge, a suggestion that the recall had been tainted by improper campaigning, and a rumor that a former officer had attempted to hire enforcement counsel to pursue personal vendettas. The association's counsel advised a forensic audit. The audit, dull and clinical, produced findings that were not criminal but were embarrassing. Contracts granted without bids, expenses that drifted from purpose, and a cadence of fines levied in ways that increased revenue more than compliance. The settlement was administrative, a repayment plan for 2 individuals and new procurement rules. The drama was less than streaming-worthy, which is exactly how good governance sounds. With ground rules amended and drama turning to policy, the garden grew into its role without needing to shout. We added a little free seed library shaped like a beehive, because sometimes kitsch is the shortest road to participation. We built a small stage for lectures, and once for a string trio that played on an evening when the light refused to let go. We partnered with the library for a story walk where pages appeared along the path, a book spread across flowers so families could read with their feet. We kept ours modest, because a neighborhood is not a theme park, and ordered 2 more lanyards because people like feeling official when pouring lemonade for strangers. Economics crept in through the back gate, the way economics does. A couple on the next street opened a weekend pop-up for herbal teas sourced from the garden, surplus, and other local growers. Donations only, a suggestion box brimming with recipes. A craftsman started making cedar trellises to spec, after 3 neighbors asked where mine came from. And he shipped 2 to a town we'd never visited because social media is a shipping lane. A realtor, ever skilled at colonizing whatever is popular, started listing proximity to the public garden as a feature. Property values do what they will. The important thing was that the story attached to them had changed from fear of difference to pride in distinctiveness. On the first anniversary of the soft opening, a city council member cut a ribbon that did not need cutting, said words about community that felt almost true despite being printed on a card, and unveiled a small plaque that named the garden and then crucially credited residents of neighborhood name as its stewards. It was the opposite of a nameplate on a desk. It was the truest version of ownership I had felt since the first time I pressed a seed into soil and decided to trust it. If the story had ended there, it would have been a tidy arc, threatened demolition, public embrace, policy reform, civic partnership, But gardens are not arcs. They are cycles. Success creates maintenance. Popularity creates obligations. We needed volunteers to weed. We needed a calendar to spread the load. We needed protocols for the day someone tripped on a route, and needed a bandage and a smile that didn't sound like liability. We needed shade for August and a plan for winter interest. We needed to make the place's survival ordinary. So we wrote a maintenance manual with the precision of people who had learned that details save futures. We trained docents on how to speak in the key of welcome. We wrote down the irrigation schedule and laminated it because of course we did. The HOA built a page on its site that linked to ours, turning the old adversary into an administrative ally. The bulldozer stayed in the land of cautionary tales. The next chapter would not be about fighting them. It would be about remembering why we fought in the first place. A year and a half after the first notice landed like a moth with fangs, the garden woke to spring with an authority that felt earned. The salvias threw color like confetti. The milkweed returned without needing permission. The rosemary hummed with life that had memorized the root. The trellis, once a defendant on trial, held a clematis that had decided to become a curtain. I walked the path before the first Saturday hour and checked the details, edges tidy, gravel topped up, signs straight. Bird bath filled, the donation box unlocked with the hopeful absurdity of a lemonade stand. The neighborhood moved at a new pace. People walked not to get somewhere, but to pass by. They brought relatives visiting from out of town to show them the thing that had been almost bulldozed, telling the story with a pride usually reserved for historic theaters and improbable diners. Children who learned to say B without flinching now corrected adults who called every flying thing a wasp. The HOA newsletter listed upcoming workshops next to pool hours, as if that had always been normal. The old guard still muttered online about uniformity, a word that now sounded like someone trying to squeeze a river into a straw. Tourists came, but they were the polite kind, the sort who read signs and buy local ice cream and leave reviews that used the phrase hidden gem like a secret handshake. The city updated its microparks map with a dotted line, connecting the garden to a mural and a bookstore and a pocket playground with a swing that squeaks. Neighbors started second acts they did not know they wanted. A Saturday scone table. A bench built by a retired engineer who discovered wood has the same kindness as steel if you cut it the right way. A zine made by teens that interviewed old-timers about what the creek used to sound like before it went underground. HOA's role shrank from adversary to infrastructure. The new board handled trash contracts and asphalt bids with the relief of a person who finds meaning in spreadsheets. They formed a landscape innovation panel that met quarterly to hear proposals for pocket habitats. Guided by a rubric that valued safety and contribution over sameness, they turned enforcement into coaching. They still had to say no sometimes, but now the no sounded like care rather than control. The budget line for council returned to its old sleepy number. The special assessment threat evaporated into the kind of surplus that buys new pool chairs. It turns out that when you stop paying to fight your residents, you can start paying to serve them. I found my energy rearranged. The fight had been a furnace. The maintenance was a hearth. I spent more time showing scouts how to turn grass clippings into compost and less time reading bylaws until my eyes crossed. I watched people discover the satisfaction of deadheading a plant. The way that giving the garden a haircut turns into a promise of more bloom. I watched grief loosen its grip in others the way it had in me, not because gardens cure anything, but because they offer a room where pain has somewhere to sit and look at something that grows anyway. On a late summer evening, we hosted a twilight walk. The air was the temperature of a hand you trust. Moths tested the porch light like tiny drunks. We handed out cards listing night-blooming plants and invited people to tune their eyes to shadows. Someone pointed out a bat tracing loops overhead, and the entire group looked up with an awe that belongs to children and astronomers. The garden felt less like a place and more like evidence. The bulldozer still exists, of course, in the world and in the narrative. Machines aren't villains. They're tools that do what they're told. Sometimes we tell them to knock down what stands in the way. Sometimes we tell them to lift compost into a bin, so a community can feed its soil. The same loader that once idled on my street arrived a year later to help build raised beds for a school around the corner. The operator, grinning at the absurdity of life, its regressions, and the way enemies can become collaborators when a permit number replaces a threat. The moral people asked me to extract from all this mutated over time. At first, it was about standing your ground with paperwork and persistence. Later, it became about the alchemy that turned personal stubbornness into public joy. Now, when I try to name it, the word that comes is stewardship. Not just of a yard, but of a climate that needs every friendly leaf we can grow. Of a community that needs reasons to talk that are not complaints. Of children who deserve to inherit something that feels alive because their elders decided it mattered. Rules did not disappear. They grew up. They learned to differentiate between nuisance and nuance. The HOA still mails notices, some of them even to me. When I let the signboard lean too long after a gust, or forget to drag the bins back before sunset, I read them without dread. Governance is a conversation with an address. It isn't exciting when it's working. That's how you know it's working. On the second anniversary, we planted an oak at the end of the block, where a patch of dirt had always seemed to wait.
Ow.
The hole was deeper than expected. The soil reluctant, the root ball heavier than pride. Neighbors took turns with the shovel. Children packed soil with the seriousness of sculptors. We watered until the ground gulped inside. The oak looked both tiny and inevitable. Someone suggested a name. We did not name it. Not because names don't matter, but because some things should belong to the future without our fingerprints all over them. As dusk settled, I walked the path one last time, the gravel crunch a hymn I had learned by heart. The trellis threw a shadow that had become a brand. The sign with ours reflected the streetlight. The donation box held a few bills and a note that read like a ritual. Thank you for making this. The garden, once almost erased by a letter, had written itself into a place that would be hard to remove, because too many people had memorized the way it made them feel. The story closed not with a slam, but with a click, the sound of a gate latched for the night. Tomorrow would bring weeds and watering and a teenager who would ask if they could host a poetry reading on the path, if everyone whispered. It would bring a neighbor who wanted to know the name of the plant with purple spikes that the bees loved, and a mail carrier who would leave a package on the bench because they liked the view for a second. It would bring inevitably another attempt by rules to calcify, as all structures do. But now the neighborhood knew what to do with structure. Plant something through it, around it, and when it deserved it, within it. The bulldozer had idled and turned away. The garden had learned to speak in the language of permits and petals. The neighborhood had learned to be known for something besides beige. And I had learned that when threatened, you can either shrink to fit or grow until the story has to resize itself. This one resized the block. The rest is maintenance, which is another word for love made practical.